It was hands down the most mortifying radio call ever broadcast during the Vietnam War. In late September of 1969, a seasoned American Special Forces major stood on a muddy helipad at Fire Support Base Delta and openly smirked at his so-called partners. He watched a squad of Australian SAS troopers take angle grinders and hacksaws to their rifles, actually cutting down the barrels of top-tier military precision weapons inside a sweltering tin shed. To the Americans who worshipped firepower and cutting-edge gear, it looked like outright lunacy. The major turned to his team and muttered, "Check out these clowns. They'll be dead inside 10 days. He was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Because barely 5 hours later, that same major wasn't smirking anymore. He was pinned in triple canopy jungle, surrounded by North Vietnamese regulars, screaming into his handset for anyone to get him out. And the only people racing toward his position were the very clowns with the chopped-down rifles. What happened next didn't merely save his skin. It embarrassed the entire American way of war and quietly forced whole chapters of field manuals to be rewritten in small type. To understand how, we have to go back to that sweltering shed where the cutting started. On the 22nd of September, 1969, an American recon platoon leader stepped off a slick at the Australian Forward Operating Base near the Song Bay River and immediately gagged. The stench hit like a wall, layered, organic, hostile. It smelled of rotting vegetation, old blood, swamp gas, and something his mind could only label as deliberate human filth. He'd been in country 21 months. He'd walked through burn wards, freshly mortared hamlets, mass graves. Nothing prepared him for the odor rolling off the Australian troopers who were rigging for a long-range patrol less than 50 meters away. First thought, supply failure. Second thought, court-martial offense. No professional unit would let its men reach that level of squalor on purpose. He walked up to the nearest Australian warrant officer to offer hygiene kits, delousing powder, anything. The Aussie's reply carried a razor edge the American never forgot. "That smell isn't a mistake, mate. That smell is policy, and it's exactly why our blokes go home breathing while yours go home in aluminum." The American demanded answers. What he got was a masterclass that shattered everything he thought he knew about the war he'd been fighting for almost 2 years. But the smell was only the opening shock. The weapons horrified him more. The footwear baffled him completely, and what happened 4 days later along a tributary of the Dong Nai produced the single most humiliating voice transmission in the history of American special operations. The numbers told a story the Pentagon spent years trying to bury. Australian SAS patrols operating in Binh Duong province were averaging 1 friendly casualty for roughly every 450 enemy killed. American outfits running the exact same mission profiles in neighboring sectors were averaging 1 to 11. That wasn't a small difference. That was a catastrophe. It screamed that one method was devastatingly effective while the other was quietly bleeding the United States dry. The Australian method started with scent. Every American trooper in Vietnam carried the regulation hygiene pack: soap bars, stick deodorant, shaving foam, fluoride toothpaste, jungle juice insect repellent. The U.S. Army viewed personal cleanliness as foundational to discipline and fighting spirit. Clean men were reliable men. That logic had ruled American military thinking since the mud of the Argonne in 1917. The NVA and Viet Cong had weaponized it. Interrogation after interrogation produced the same answer. American patrols could be smelled from 400 meters downwind on a humid day. The sharp chemical tang of American soap and deodorant was as alien to the jungle as jet fuel. Insect repellent lingered for hours. Virginia Tobacco cigarettes broadcast position like a beacon for any scout within 1.5 kilometers. The Australians erased every marker. 3 weeks before insertion, they stopped using soap entirely. No deodorant, no shaving cream, no commercial toothpaste. They switched to local roll-your-own tobacco or quit smoking. They ate the same fermented shrimp paste, nuoc mam, and jungle forage their enemies ate. food that rewrote body chemistry from the inside. By the time they crossed the wire, they smelled exactly like the forest floor. Mold, wet earth, decaying leaves. The tactical payoff showed up in classified sit reps that American brass found hard to swallow. NVA reconnaissance teams routinely walked within 3 meters of perfectly still Australian ambush positions and registered nothing out of place. In one documented contact from August of 1968, an enemy point man actually kicked an Aussie's ankle, glanced down, saw only leaf litter and vines, and kept walking. The trooper never twitched, never breathed hard. The enemy never knew he had stepped on a man who could have ended him before his next heartbeat. Scent discipline was just layer one. The weapon modifications made American ordnance technicians physically angry. The recon platoon leader noticed the Australian rifles looked wrong immediately. Barrels too short, balance off. Up close, he saw fresh saw marks and welding beads. Someone had deliberately taken a perfectly good rifle and amputated about 12 centimeters from the muzzle. The standard Australian rifle was the inch pattern L1A1, essentially the same battle rifle as the FNFAL, legendary for accuracy out to 400 meters and legendary reliability. American armorers rated it roughly on par with the M14, and the Australians were butchering it on purpose. They chopped the barrel, they ditched the flash hider, they welded on crude wire and wood forward grips. The finished product looked like something a desperate guerrilla might cobble together in the hills, not issue gear for Tier 1 special operations. U.S. weapons experts who inspected the guns were livid. Ballistics ruined. Effective range cut by at least 2/3. The things were loud, wildly inaccurate beyond 30 meters, and looked amateur. The Australians called their chopped-down rifles the pig stabber, and swore the weapon was purpose-built for where it would actually be used. In Vietnamese jungle, average engagement distance was 12 to 18 meters. Not 100, not 400, 18. A rifle that could hit man-sized targets at 400 meters was dead weight when you couldn't see past the next bamboo clump. Worse, long barrels snagged constantly on vines, rattan, wait-a-minute vines. Every hang-up meant stopping, yanking, cursing, making noise. Every noise was a death warrant. The pig stabber glided through undergrowth like a machete blade. No snags. The loss of long-range precision didn't matter. There was no long range. And the full-power 7.62 NATO round, even from a sawed-off barrel, still hit like a sledgehammer. The American 5.56 M16 threw a lighter, faster bullet designed for flat trajectory at distance. Up close, it often zipped straight through, letting determined men keep coming for precious seconds. The 7.62 from a pig stabber didn't wound at 10 meters. It dismantled. The footwear baffled the American even more. Several of the Aussies gearing up were wearing sandals, crude sandals cut from truck tire treads with inner tube straps. The American recognized them instantly. They were the same footwear favored by Main Force Viet Cong and NVA regulars across the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. Why the hell were elite Australian soldiers wearing enemy sandals? The answer revealed a tactical sophistication the American playbook had never even imagined. Tracking was the NVA's bread-and-butter method for locating and fixing enemy patrols. Every American jungle boot left a unique tread pattern, distinctive enough that any halfway competent tracker could tell exactly what he was following, how many, how long ago, which direction. The Australians erased that signature too. By wearing captured enemy sandals, they left tracks indistinguishable from friendly guerrilla movement. A tracker who cut those prints would assume he was trailing his own side. No alarm. No call for an ambush team. He might even walk straight into the Australian kill zone thinking he was linking up with comrades. That wasn't their only anti-tracking trick. They waded streams whenever possible. They stepped on roots, rocks, fallen logs instead of soft dirt. When they had to cross mud, the last man in file used a leafy branch to sweep the prints away. All of it cost time and effort, but it made Australian patrols functionally untrackable. The NVA, who had hunted French paratroopers for years, who shadowed ARVN battalions with ease, who routinely ghosted American patrols, simply could not find the Australians. The hunters became the hunted, and they never knew why. But there was something else the American noticed about the Australians that disturbed him on a deeper level. It was how they spoke about the enemy. Americans used all kinds of terms for the other side. Victor Charlie, Mr. Charlie, gooks, dinks, slopes. The vocabulary ranged from neutral shorthand to pure contempt. The unspoken premise was always the same. The enemy was primitive, backward, outclassed, destined to be crushed by superior American technology and firepower. The Australians called them comrade men. Not mocking, not ironic. Formal respect, delivered deadpan. Briefings treated enemy capabilities with clinical detail. Tactics were studied, not dismissed. Enemy victories were dissected for lessons, not waved away as flukes or American mistakes. The Australians didn't hate their enemy. They respected him as a lethal, experienced opponent who had been fighting in that exact terrain for generations and had earned every bit of caution he demanded. That respect had battlefield consequences. American patrols frequently walked into contact assuming their tech edge would carry the day. Australian patrols assumed nothing and prepared for everything. Americans sometimes died because they underestimated. Australians lived because they never did. The difference in pace was what finally pushed American observers past professional tolerance into outright fury. The United States military believed in speed, violence of action, and overwhelming fires. Those principles had crushed the Axis, held the line in Korea, made America the unchallenged superpower. When American long-range patrols moved out, they averaged 2.5 kilometers per day, considered a reasonable compromise between stealth and momentum. The Australian SAS moved at 120 meters per hour. When the American recon leader first heard the number, he thought it was a mistranslation. 120 meters per hour meant a single kilometer took the better part of a full day. A 10-kilometer deep patrol could take 2 weeks. It sounded not merely slow, but criminally negligent. The Australians offered to demonstrate. What the American witnessed in 40 minutes rewrote his entire understanding of infantry movement. 4 troopers slipped into the green wall 50 meters from the perimeter wire. The lead man took one deliberate step, foot placed with surgical care on ground that would take weight without sound or compression. Then the entire patrol froze. Not slowed down, zero movement. They held that freeze for 5 full minutes. During those minutes, the American watched them scan with only their eyes, never turning heads. Nostrils flared subtly, tasting air currents. Fingers made microscopic shifts on weapons, ready for instant violence while appearing completely inert. Ears strained, parsing every jungle sound. After 5 minutes, another single step. Another 5-minute freeze. In 40 minutes, they covered perhaps 60 meters. The American stood 20 meters away and heard nothing. No leaf rustle, no twig snap, no foot placement. 4 armed men had moved 60 meters through primary jungle in absolute silence. The logic was merciless. Patrols moving 2.5 kilometers per day created detectable signatures, breaking branches, crushed undergrowth, vibrations through root networks that listening posts could pick up hundreds of meters away. At 120 meters per hour, no signature survived long enough to matter. The jungle soundscape healed completely between movements. Birds kept singing. Cicadas kept buzzing. Gibbon calls never stopped. Areas the Australians used sounded untouched. Nothing to report. Nothing to investigate. Nothing to ambush. But slow movement gave more than concealment. It turned the Australians into apex predators. Moving that slowly, they detected enemy activity long before being detected themselves. NVA patrols moving at normal speed created exactly the disturbances the Australians had trained to recognize. A team that had spent 6 hours motionless could hear an approaching column from astonishing distances. The hunters became the prey, without ever realizing it. That explained the impossible kill ratios. The Australians weren't better shots. They weren't braver. They were invisible. They struck from places no one expected and vanished before any effective reply was possible. 4 days later, American doctrine failed so spectacularly that even the most determined institutional denial couldn't hide the evidence. The 101st Airborne Division's 2nd Brigade was one of the most respected outfits in theater. The Screaming Eagles had air assaulted into every major campaign, built a reputation for relentless aggression. When fresh intelligence located a major enemy staging area along a tributary of the Dong Nai, the brigade drew the mission. The rifle company tasked with the operation numbered 132 paratroopers, led by a West Point captain on his 2nd tour, holder of a Silver Star, widely regarded as one of the sharpest company commanders in division. His men were hardened veterans of multiple combat tours. They carried the newest American kit, wore standard jungle fatigues, followed standard hygiene SOPs. They smelled like Americans. They moved like Americans. They would fight like Americans. An Australian SAS patrol was working independently in the same grid square. 5 men led by a sergeant major with 4 tours already under his belt. They had been in the bush for 8 days, moving at their glacial pace, collecting intelligence on enemy lines of communication. They wore enemy sandals. They carried pig stabbers. They hadn't washed in 23 days. The two forces knew of each other but had not coordinated. The American captain saw no need. His company would handle the task using proven American methods. What he didn't know was that the Australian patrol had already located the exact target his company was blindly searching for. 5 days of patient stalking had put them in observation range of a reinforced NVA regimental forward headquarters. They spent 38 hours in one concealed hide, counting, sketching, documenting. They identified over 260 enemy combatants. They mapped bunkers, heavy weapons positions, supply caches. They watched a division-level liaison team arrive by foot. They noted sentry patterns, meal times, ammo resupply routines. They passed the intelligence up their own chain. Somewhere in the relay, the report stalled, was downgraded, or simply never reached the Americans. The rifle company walked straight into the killing zone blind. They were advancing on an entrenched enemy force 10 times their strength and had no idea. The NVA heard them from 350 meters. The regimental commander had almost 40 minutes to position his welcome party. The ambush erupted at 13:22 hours. Classic double V-shaped L. Automatic weapons and RPGs opened simultaneously from 2 converging axes. The NVA had studied American patterns for years. They knew exactly where LZs would be established, exactly which trails would be used, exactly how long until supporting fires arrived. 28 Americans dropped in the first 30 seconds. The captain survived because he was walking center file instead of point. He executed the book response. Return fire, call artillery, request gunships, form a defensive perimeter. Everything by the numbers. Artie impacted within 9 minutes. Gunships arrived in 17. The full weight of American firepower slammed the enemy positions. None of it mattered. The NVA were in deep, camouflaged fighting holes prepared over weeks. They had survived American artillery barrages for years and knew exactly how to endure them. When shells fell, they hunkered in overhead-covered positions designed to shrug off near misses. When gunships rolled in, they used the canopy and spider holes and shifted through concealed crawl trenches. The Americans couldn't see their enemy. They were shooting at muzzle flashes and suspected tree lines, burning ammunition against ghosts. The enemy could see every move. Every few minutes, another paratrooper went down to aimed fire from invisible positions. By 14:15, the company had taken over 50 casualties. Ammo was critically low. Artillery had churned hundreds of square meters of jungle without a single confirmed kill. The gunships had emptied their pods into shadows. The captain realized his unit was being methodically dissected by an enemy his firepower could not reach. At 14:39, he made the most humiliating radio transmission of his life. He requested immediate assistance from the Australian SAS patrol he had pointedly declined to coordinate with 4 days earlier. The sergeant major listened to the traffic, heard the desperation, calculated the rate of attrition, and made his decision in under 90 seconds. Doctrine said avoid decisive engagement. Inserting into an active L-shaped ambush with 5 men against a reinforced regiment was suicide by any conventional metric. But men were dying while he listened. He would help, but he would do it the Australian way. When the American captain learned the relief force was advancing at 120 meters per hour, he lost his mind. His people were bleeding out in real time. Help was less than 2 kilometers away, and it was apparently sleepwalking through the jungle at a pace that would arrive sometime next Tuesday. He demanded they move faster. The sergeant major refused. He explained calmly that faster movement meant noise, meant scent plume, meant detection, and detected help would only add 5 more bodies to the pile without changing the outcome. The captain would have to hold until the patrol reached a position from which they could actually influence the fight. The next 108 minutes were the longest of the American captain's military career. What he could not see was that the Australians were not moving toward his perimeter. They were moving through the enemy perimeter. Using the roar of the firefight as acoustic cover, using scent discipline to remain invisible, 5 men infiltrated directly through the NVA rear areas, straight into the heart of the regimental position. They passed within arm's reach of enemy soldiers focused on the Americans to their front. They navigated a full-scale engagement without creating a single disturbance that might give them away. At one point, an NVA machine gunner paused less than 2 meters from the sergeant major to change belts. The Australian remained utterly motionless while the enemy reloaded and returned to his gun. The gunner never knew death had been one squeeze away. At 16:27, the patrol achieved the impossible. They were inside the NVA defensive belt, 40 meters from the regimental command post, surrounded by more than 260 fighters who had no clue they were there. The sergeant major began adjusting artillery. These were not the broad, danger-close missions that had accomplished nothing for hours. These were surgically precise corrections, coordinates accurate to within 10 meters. He could see exactly where the command group was directing the battle. He could see the heavy machine guns chewing up the American perimeter. He could see the ammo resupply points, the reinforcement trails, the planned withdrawal routes. The first adjusted mission landed squarely on the regimental CP. The commander, his operations officer, and most of the staff vanished in a single earth-shaking detonation. Command and control disintegrated instantly. The second mission silenced the primary 12.7 heavy machine gun responsible for nearly half the American casualties. The third mission sealed the main exfiltration corridor. NVA, trying to break contact, ran straight into pre-registered killing zones. The fourth mission obliterated the central ammo cache. Cooking off rounds lit the jungle for the next 20 minutes. In 21 minutes, the entire dynamic reversed. The force that had been carving apart an American rifle company was now being systematically dismantled with devastating accuracy. Invisible positions were suddenly hit dead on. Escape routes were closed before they could be used. Leadership was decapitated before new orders could be given. The surviving NVA broke and ran, abandoning weapons, wounded, and cohesion. The American company, which had been facing annihilation, managed to consolidate and prepare for extraction. Final tally: 39 Americans killed, 57 wounded out of 132 engaged. Enemy losses estimated at 94 killed, unknown additional wounded and missing. The Australian patrol that had penetrated the enemy position and called fire from inside their lines suffered 0 casualties. The after-action reports were locked behind the highest classification, not for OPSEC, but for institutional protection. 5 Australians using primitive methods had achieved what 132 elite American paratroopers, backed by unlimited fires, could not. They hadn't just rescued the unit, they had proven beyond any possibility of denial that one doctrine was producing disaster while another produced survival. The most damning evidence came from the other side. Captured documents from early 1970 revealed that the NVA had developed entirely separate tactical guidance for dealing with Australian versus American forces. Against Americans, exploit predictability. Helicopter insertions created massive noise signatures kilometers away. Patrols moved at trackable speeds and left clear trails. Soldiers could be smelled from 400 meters. Doctrine favored rapid escalation to heavy supporting arms, creating exploitable patterns that allowed assault teams to disengage before effective counter-battery fire arrived. Recommended tactic: violent close-range ambush, maximum casualties in the first 45 seconds, immediate withdrawal along prepared routes before artillery becomes decisive. Against Australians, complete avoidance whenever possible. Do not initiate contact unless forced. Do not attempt ambush. Australian detection range and patience made it more likely they would see the trap first. Do not pursue. Australian counterattack doctrine made such actions suicidal. If contact was unavoidable, break clean immediately and withdraw to sectors where Australian patrols were not active. The documents used one specific term for the Australian soldiers, a term applied to no other Allied unit. They called them Rung Ma, forest ghosts. The phrase carried weight beyond ordinary military caution. The NVA were not simply wary of Australian forces, they were genuinely afraid in a way they never were of Americans. And that fear had measurable effects on the battlefield. Enemy activity in the Australian area of operations was consistently lower than in adjacent American zones. NVA units that happily attacked American positions refused to cross into Australian-controlled ground. When they did, their posture changed completely, cautious, defensive, almost timid. American commanders noticed. They demanded explanations. Maybe the Australians were in less important terrain. Maybe they were avoiding contact to keep casualty stats low. Maybe they were cooking their after-action reports. The captured orders destroyed every alternative explanation. The enemy was explicitly telling its troops to avoid the Australians because the Australians were more dangerous. The war went on. American patrols kept moving at detectable speeds. American soldiers kept smelling like targets. American doctrine kept prioritizing firepower over patience, technology over adaptation. The casualties kept mounting. But the real cost of the Australian method was never captured in any kill ratio. Becoming invisible for weeks on end exacted a price measured in different currency: psychological, moral, human. Operating at 120 meters per hour for days in enemy-controlled terrain required a transformation that left permanent scars. Constant hypervigilance could not be turned off. Absolute suppression of normal human impulses created patterns that did not reverse when the mission ended. Some veterans described the state as becoming something not quite human, shedding the internal monologue of plans, worries, memories, future thoughts. The mind in that state existed in pure sensory present. No tomorrow, no yesterday, only now, only threat, only environment. That state made them invisible in ways no ghillie suit ever could. An enemy could stare directly at their position and see nothing because there were no behavioral tells to read. But that state could not be switched off when the helicopter arrived for extraction. Many struggled for decades with noise, crowds, bright lights, emotional intimacy, things they had deliberately trained themselves to suppress in order to survive. The NVA called them forest ghosts. But ghosts are creatures trapped between worlds, never fully in one, never able to return to the other. The men who mastered that jungle war often found themselves similarly suspended. Coming home alive was not the same as coming home whole, and yet the methods worked. The survival rates proved it beyond argument. 50 years on, the lessons are still relevant. Every new war replays the same tragedy: technological arrogance meeting environmental reality, institutional certainty colliding with conditions those institutions cannot comprehend, the expensive way failing while the simple way succeeds. The Australians figured it out in 1967. It took decades for others to even begin listening. Some say they still haven't fully learned. Rung Ma, the forest ghosts. The soldiers mocked as primitives until they proved themselves the deadliest hunters in the green hell. They saved the men who laughed at them. That is their legacy. That is what they proved. That is what they left for anyone willing to listen. The only real question is whether the people who need the lesson most will ever be humble enough to accept it. The Australians answered that question more than half a century ago in the jungles north of Saigon. The institutions that ignored them are still working on their reply.